All right. Hey ho, let's go. This is Resistance Radio, where natural selection selects resistance. And today we are asking whether holding Anthony Fauci in contempt teaches anything about preventing the next pandemic. This week, the Senate voted to hold Dr. Anthony Fauci in contempt of Congress after he invoked his Fifth Amendment rights during testimony. Depending on which headlines you read, that was either a long overdue accountability or political theater. I think both sides are asking the wrong question. As an infectious disease physician, I'm less interested in relitigating COVID than I am in understanding what lessons we're taking away from it, because the lessons we choose today will shape how we respond to the next pandemic. And here is my concern. If the big takeaway from COVID is that we should spend years trying to find one person to blame, then we've already learned the wrong lesson. Now, listen, don't misunderstand me. Public officials should be absolutely held accountable. Scientists should be accountable. Public health agencies should be accountable. If mistakes were made, and they were, we should study them honestly, fix them, and then build stronger systems. But accountability and scapegoating are not the same thing. One helps us prepare for the future. The other mostly helps cable news fill another hour. That's why I don't want to spend the next few minutes arguing about whether Anthony Fauci is a hero or a villain. Frankly, that's not very interesting. The more interesting question is why 6 years after COVID changed the world, we're still arguing about one man instead of asking whether we've actually fixed the problems that made the pandemic so devastating in the first place. Because public health has never really been about heroes. It's never been about villains. It's actually about systems. And systems fail or succeed because of policy. And that's the lens I want you to use as we walk through the story. So let's begin with the allegations. The major claims against Dr. Fauci generally fall into three categories. First, that NIH funded research connected to coronaviruses at the Wuhan Institute of Virology ultimately contributed to the pandemic. Second, Dr. Fauci misled Congress about the research and whether it was qualified as gain of function. And third, that helped shape scientific communication in ways that discouraged discussion of the laboratory leak hypothesis. Now, these are serious allegations, and serious allegations deserve something that has become surprisingly rare in modern public discourse: precision. Not slogans, not memes, not viral clips. Precision. Because once precision disappears, politics usually rushes in to fill that space. So let's start with the most misunderstood phrase of this entire debate, and that is gain of function research. If you listen to the political debates over the last few years, you could easily come away believing that gain of function is one specific experiment where scientists deliberately build superviruses in a laboratory. And that's just simply not true. Gain of function is an umbrella term describing research that gives an organism a new property or enhances an existing one. Sometimes that's increasing transmissibility. Sometimes it's helping scientists understand how viruses adapt to new hosts. Sometimes it's entirely unrelated to pandemics. That doesn't mean every experiment is safe. Actually, far from it. Some research involving dangerous pathogens absolutely deserve strict oversight. And some scientists have argued for even stronger restrictions for years. Others believe carefully regulated work is necessary to prepare vaccines and treatments before nature performs the experiment for us. Now, reasonable experts will disagree, and that's the point, right? Scientific disagreement isn't evidence of corruption, it's evidence that science and the process is actually working. Science advances because people argue with data, not because everybody agrees. Politics, on the other hand, rewards certainty. Scientists are rewarded for changing their minds when better evidence appears. For example, imagine if your GPS never updated after a bridge washed out because it didn't want to look inconsistent. You wouldn't call that reliable, you call that broken. Science updates for exactly the same reason. Changing your mind because new evidence emerges is not weakness. That's the job description. So let's talk about Dr. Fauci then invoking the Fifth Amendment. I've heard countless commentators say that innocent people don't plead the Fifth, and that's just not how our Constitution works. The Fifth Amendment protects individuals from being compelled to incriminate themselves. It doesn't determine guilt or innocence. Courts determine guilt or innocence. Now, whether you agree with Dr. Fauci's decision or not, exercising a constitutional right itself is not evidence of wrongdoing. Otherwise, we'd have to argue that everyone who hires an attorney is admitting guilt. Now, I don't think most Americans would buy that argument. And here is where I think the conversation becomes much more interesting. In public health, one of the first questions we learn to ask is simple: what are the incentives? Follow the incentives and you'll understand behavior far better than if you simply assign heroes and villains. Scientists have incentives. Academic institutions have incentives. Pharmaceutical companies have incentives. Politicians have incentives. Cable news and media have incentives, and social media certainly has their own incentives as well. And yes, publishers and authors have incentives too. One detail that received surprisingly little attention is that renewed public attention surrounding Dr. Fauci, according to the New York Times earlier this week, also coincided with renewed promotion of books written by several of his most prominent critics. The point isn't that selling books is wrong. People write books all the time. The point is consistency. If we're going to scrutinize financial and political incentives, let's scrutinize everyone's incentives, not just the incentives of people that we already disagree with. Otherwise, accountability quietly turns into tribalism. And tribalism has never cured a single infectious disease. In the end, what we were seeing is book sales have gone up for his most prominent critics. Here's what keeps me awake at night. Picture a young, brilliant virologist just finishing her fellowship today. She watches what happened during COVID. She watches scientists receiving death threats. She watches years of political investigations. She watches emails become national headlines. She watches scientific uncertainty reframed as evidence of deception. Now ask yourself a simple question. Would you encourage her to become the next face of public health during a future pandemic? Or would you quietly advise her to stay in the laboratory where nobody knows her name? That's not her problem. That's actually our problem, because pandemics don't send invitations. When the next novel pathogen emerges, and there will be another one, we're going to need experienced scientists willing to stand in front of cameras and tell the public the uncomfortable truths. If today's incentive is public humiliation years after the crisis ends, don't be surprised if tomorrow's experts decide someone else can take up that mantle and the microphone. Public health depends on trust. Trust depends on transparency. Transparency depends on experts being willing to speak honestly, even when they don't have every answer. And if we punish uncertainty itself, we'll end up rewarding false certainty. And history has shown us repeatedly that false certainty is far more dangerous than honest uncertainty. So, what should accountability actually look like? It should ask whether our disease surveillance systems worked, whether our laboratory oversight was sufficient, whether our public health agencies communicated clearly, whether hospitals had enough protective equipment, whether nursing homes were protected, whether supply chains held together, whether states coordinated instead of competing, whether we invested enough in preparedness before disaster arrived instead of scrambling after it was already here. Those are the questions that make us safer. Those are the questions that improve public health. Those are the questions that honor the millions of people whose lives were permanently changed by COVID. Everything else risks being political theater. And I'll leave you with this. Viruses don't care about political parties. They don't care whether you're conservative or progressive. They don't care who won the hearing. They don't care who sold the most books. They don't care who scored the best clip on social media. Viruses exploit weaknesses. And one of the greatest weaknesses we can create is teaching society that science should fear politics more than pathogens. That's not accountability. That's deference. And deference doesn't just discourage bad scientists. It discourages the good ones too. Public health failures are almost always public policy failures. They happen when evidence is ignored, when institutions are weakened, when incentives reward outrage instead of learning, and when politics becomes more important than preparedness. Those failures rarely fall equally. They land hardest on people with the fewest resources, with the least political power, and with the fewest options to protect themselves. If we spend the next decade looking for the one villain instead of building better systems, we'll have wasted the most painful public health lesson of our lifetime, because the next pandemic isn't waiting for us to finish arguing about the last one. So this is Resistance Radio, where natural selection selects resistance, and the strongest societies aren't the ones that punish science. They're the ones that learn enough from it to protect the people who actually need it the most. Thank you for tuning in. I'm Mark Allen Derry.